Hitting it.
Great, thanks so much. So, hi everyone. Happy Sunday. Welcome to West Coast Culinary Symposium second day. I am Lady Elisheva bat Yisrael, and I am going to be talking about this dish that I found in several different cookbooks across several different centuries within the Arab-speaking world. And they all had this dish in them, this dish that I'm calling Sikbaj. I'm not 100% sure of my pronunciation, but this is what I'm going to go with for this. So there's 4 different recipes, and I was really intrigued because it's very clearly the same dish, but there's these slight variations in each region, in each version of the recipe. So I wanted to go through and see how these all differed and compared to one another. So that's what we're doing, is a comparison between all of these different recipe versions. So first, what is Sikbaj? What is this weird sounding dish? So it's a soured meat dish. It's usually soured with a vinegar agent. It always has meat. Some of them also have a sweetener, so then it becomes a sweet and sour dish. Several recipes also include vegetables, and then there's various garnishes. So the picture here is an example. This is the example that I did at last Great West for our camp. As just a tester. I wanted to see how this would come out. This is an Egyptian version, and so far, of all the ones that I've made, this is my favorite. It is served with a lavash bread on the side and some pickled eggs, which was one of the recommendations as an accompanying side for this dish from the Egyptian cookbook. So but starting at the beginning, what are all the different versions we're going to look at? So the first one is from a 10th century Baghdadi cookbook. This is the Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq book, available mundanely as Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen translated by Nawal Nasrallah. Amazing, amazing book. And so this is Baghdad. The map the picture on the left is a representation of Baghdad, the circular city. And on the right, we have a little map so you can kind of orient yourself as to where in the Arab-speaking world this was coming from in the 10th century. The recipe itself has several different elements. There's actually a couple different versions within this book. The first is a very extravagant version, and it starts off with this whole story of a particular slave girl, Bida, and the sikbaj that she made for Al-Amin. It's a very elaborate story of how her master, was asked to bring her in because she had a reputation for being such a good cook. And so they asked her to make her sikbaj, and that she started off with smoking the meat with various aromatic agents like aloes wood and ambergris, for perfuming both the meat and the cooking vessel with perfume smoke, and then also using all of these amazing spices and vegetables and a ton of extras. So this particular version, they say there's multiple kinds of meat, there's multiple kinds of garnishes. So there's big sausages and small sausages and bread rolls, rolled sandwiches and meat patties and mustard. So it was very specific that this was served with mustard as an accompaniment, as well as these different vegetables and pieces of bread as dividers in the section. So the idea is to present it on this very large platter with these different sections of various meats and vegetable and bread and mustard. So I tried to do this. So I put this together using I did the eggplant and carrots and onions as the recommendation. The bread, obviously, this is just a sourdough that I made at home. So not, probably not the style of bread that they would have used. They mentioned, cutting a kind of a leavened flatbread into triangles, but this gives you a bit of the same kind of an effect. There's mustard in the center. The vegetables in the original recipe were just boiled in vinegar. So I did half the plate with these kind of boiled vegetables. And the other half of the plate, I did with roasted eggplant because I really like roasted eggplant or grilled eggplant. And I found the grilled eggplant tastier, but that's, you know, just because how I like it. This particular redaction, there was no sweetener. So the meat is very sharp. And then having the mustard as an addition, it's also very sharp. My one caveat here is I did not actually home make the mustard from the mustard recipe in the book. So there's a chance that their mustard recipe is a little bit different, but it did also include basically mustard seed and vinegar, which are the two primary ingredients for our modern mustards as well. So I'm betting that the flavor profile would be similar. So this is a really fun presentation of this dish, although I think flavor-wise, maybe not exactly my favorite because I think it really does need some sweet to balance it out. And this Sikbaj did not have sweetener in it. So, but 10th century Baghdad, pretty, and there's like lots of opportunities to make this more impressive and to do multiple kinds of meat instead of just beef and stuff. So the next one is Anonymous Andalusian. So from the Anonymous Andalusian book, or cookbook set, the translation was done, I believe, by Charles Perry. And the map on the right kind of gives you the idea of what was Al-Andalus at the period roughly around when this cookbook was written. So this is during the Berber Almohad region or reign of the lower half of the Iberian Peninsula. So there had already been the start of the Reconquista. So the Christian kingdoms have kind of, pushed down into about halfway through the peninsula, but there's still a lot of territory at the bottom that is under Al-Andalus Almohad control. And this particular version, there is, again, meat, although it's not specified whether it's beef or some other meat. So could have been lamb, could have been goat. There's lots of options. Vinegar, also unspecified as to what type of vinegar. I used red wine vinegar. And this one does have a sweetening agent. It included raisins as the primary sweetening agent. And flavoring agents were very simple in this case. So this is not like a lot of spices or anything, mainly onion, cilantro, coriander, a little bit of garlic and some salt and pepper. And the extras or the garnish that was included that kind of differentiates this recipe from the other recipes is the inclusion of this egg crust, which also shows up in a lot of the other recipes in this particular book, where you make, or eggs in general actually are just very prominent in this particular set of recipes. So there's lots of dishes where you just add eggs, like break eggs on top of the dish and let them, continue cooking for kind of a soft egg on top, or whipping eggs into like a sauce. So there's another soured vinegar dish called mukallal, and the version from this Al-Andalusian collection has you beat up the eggs and add them to the hot broth, and then it kind of turns into a sauce, and it like thickens the sauce. But in the course of thickening the sauce, because that sauce is also vinegar based, you end up with something that like looks and tastes a lot like a mustard sauce, even though there's no mustard in it. So this one, the egg crust is interesting because you start off with hard-boiled eggs. So hard-boiled eggs mixed with breadcrumbs and like form a crust with that and like lay it over the dish. And so with this one, I actually made this for lunch yesterday. So starting off with the stewed kind of portions of meat and the raisins. I'd also already added the like onion and herbs and garlic and salt and pepper in the picture up on the right. And then I kind of, mashed hard-boiled egg yolks and some breadcrumbs into somewhat of a crust. The recipe does not say to like add water or broth or anything in order to create the crust. I think if you were really wanting to like do a full crust over the entire top of the pot, I would recommend that because just the egg yolks and the breadcrumbs, it was really crumbly. Like didn't quite kind of stick together really. So, and I used beef on this one. Sorry, I just caught that in the chat. I for all of these, I've been using beef in several of the recipes. Some of them, the type of meat is unspecified, but in other versions from other cookbooks, it specifies beef. So that's and that is what is really easily available mundanely. So that's what I've been using. The final kind of version and what I ended up with yesterday is in the larger picture on the left. And as you can see, I didn't really have enough of the egg crust to fully cover the entire top of the dish. So next time I would definitely use more egg yolks. I think I used like six or seven egg yolks for this one, and it wasn't quite enough. So I'd probably do twice as much in order to cover a full like regular skillet. But this was quite tasty. It is still a little on the sharp side because you are covering the meat with vinegar to boil and cook. So it's a lot of vinegar. If you want to cut it, you could definitely do like portion vinegar and portion water, kind of water it down a little bit and have it a little bit less sharp. But I also really like strong flavors. So yeah, I thought this was pretty tasty. It's I served this yesterday. I ate it over rice. I think really there wasn't as much rice in Al-Andalus, at least not from the recipes in that anonymous Andalusian book. There's a lot more bread products. So I think probably for doing a more period redaction of this one or a more period service, I would recommend serving it with bread or over like bread pieces or something like that. But it was pretty darn tasty over rice as well. So that's my second version of Sikbaj. The third one, I realize I'm going really fast through these, so anyone feel free to stop me and interrupt and ask questions.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat that was, what type of meat did you use?
I used beef.
Ah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, our third recipe version for this comes from the Scents and Flavors book. So this is a translation of a 13th century Syrian cookbook. The translation's by Charles Perry. On the map on the right, you can see Damascus pointed out. So this is where this book is coming from, the center of the Ayyubid dynasty in the 13th century. Ayyubid dynasty kind of going up to the tail end of that, so like the beginning of the 13th century. And this also it just says meat, and does not necessarily specify that it is beef. It does specify that this is to be wine vinegar, and uses a lot more sweetening agents. So raisins, jujubes, and sugar or honey. And has more aromatic and flavoring agents, including cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon, onion, pepper, saffron, ambergris, and mixed spices. The mixed spices here was a mix that included like betel leaf and ash tree fruits, long pepper, cardamom, and rose hips, and a number of other things. One of the things that I found like notable about this one, so this one also included vegetables and then included like some blanched almonds as extras that were included in here. One of the interesting things about this particular recipe is that it comes in the book as kind of an addition to the chapter. Like it's a little bit separate from the rest of the like meat dishes and meat recipes that are listed in the chapters. So it almost kind of looks like an add-on that may have been added by a different hand or a different scribe. And the mixed spices like collection is almost identical to the next recipe, which was from Egypt. So I actually have not made this particular one yet because it is so similar to the Egyptian recipe. I'm kind of like questioning whether this one is like really a representation of the Syrian region, or whether this is something that was like copied into this book because it was just a very popular dish. But this is like it's almost identical to the Kanz recipe, which is coming up next. So I still need to kind of dig into that a little bit more and, you know, see if I can figure out what was going on, if they were just, and like maybe it is the same recipe and they just copied it into multiple books. You know, this is definitely something that happens. But it was, you know, kind of notable that they were just so similar. Speaking of, so this is the last recipe that I've got from Kanz al-fawa'id. Then this is the book Mundanely available as Treasures Trove, Benefits and Banquet at the Table, translation by Nawal Nasrallah. And this is 14th century Egypt. So right around the time of like the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. So covering this kind of smaller region compared to the other sultanates and caliphates and things from the previous books and previous eras. It's still significant. And this one mentions meat, vinegar, same sweetening agents. So honey, although also date syrup could be used, jujubes, figs, raisins were all mentioned. This one uses aromatic and flavoring agents. So again, uses some like perfuming agents. So including aloes wood and cinnamon and coriander, rosewater, and the truffle tib spices, which are basically identical to the mixed spices blend that I saw in the Syrian cookbook. Lots of vegetable options on this one. So there would be like several kind of pairings of vegetables that would be recommended. So it would be like, you know, do taro and onion, or do quince and leeks, do, you know, eggplant and onion, and eggplant and carrots, and things like that. The extras, or the kind of additional garnishes here, included blanched almonds again, a little bit of wheat or rice starch for thickening the stew, and the pickled eggs were specifically called out as a recommended side dish. So this one, I tried to go through as faithfully as possible with the recipe procedure. And I did this on site at Great Western last year. So it started off, so the recipe calls for taking a chunk of aloes wood and putting it in the water that you are cooking the beef in. I don't know if any of you have looked into aloes wood, also called oud wood, but it's incredibly expensive. This is like a really expensive perfuming agent, and not something that you're going to like toss several ounces of into a soup, because it's like thousands of dollars per ounce. So I kind of just thought, okay, what can I substitute that would be in any way reasonable? And I really like sandalwood. I like the smell of sandalwood. It, you know, has a little bit of a similar, like it feels kind of similar from a perfuming perspective to the oud. I have like some like oud incense to kind of get a sense of, or the aloes wood incense to try and get a sense of what it smells like. And I was like, well, you know, it's not exactly the same, but I do like sandalwood as kind of having a similar vibe, and it is much more affordable and definitely attainable. So my husband very kindly like just bought a length of sandalwood and sanded it all down and kind of cleaned it off, and then cut me a chunk that I could toss into the stew here. So I cooked the meat first with this like little bit of sandalwood in it, along with the cinnamon stick and the coriander. Took you know, drained the meat a little bit, so it's not just sitting in quite so much liquid, and reserve the liquid to add to create the stew later on. This was also, you know, and I went through the process of making the dish. I added for this one, it's not pictured, not shown here, but I added squash as a gourd. So I didn't have bottle gourds, but I just used a squash from the grocery store that was really delicious. And I think really went well with the kind of sweet and sour vibe that this recipe has. This is my first time exploring jujubes, which I got fresh at our local kind of Middle Eastern / Mexican market. And they look and feel a lot like apples when you cut into them, which you can kind of see in the lower right-hand corner. So like they end up feeling and tasting a lot like kind of little tiny apples. And then, so I made this stew with all of these like interesting elements. And then I also went ahead and made the pickled eggs that kind of went with it as an aside, as a side dish. And this was my favorite so far of the ones that I've made. I like the spice blend. So the trufaltib spice blend that is included here is like the betel leaf is really earthy. There's this like really deep kind of green earthiness that's included from that and the spikenard. And I can give like the full, I'm happy to give the full list of spices and things, as well as those slides and notes and all of that to Mercy afterwards to share with everyone. But yeah, that blend is really incredibly aromatic and rich in flavor. So it's, I think so far, my favorite, in part just because it was like so flavorful, and it wasn't just the vinegar, but the sweetening part. You make a like equal parts vinegar and honey mixture with the spices, and you add that to the stew. So it's not that the meat is just stewed in like this ton of vinegar, and then the entire sauce is like mostly vinegar, but with this one, the meat is cooked in like flavored water and the perfumed water from using like the aloes wood or sandalwood in my case. And then you add the agent, the sweet and sour kind of sauce to it, and then it like cooks down and becomes this really rich sweet and sour stew. So yeah, that was this the Sikbaj from 14th century Egypt. And then I do have my references for the different books that I used to try out these different recipes. But I vastly overestimated how long it would take me to talk through these recipes. So I'm like done in half an hour. So please tell me if there's, questions, thoughts, yeah, anything.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What I am familiar with taro from Hawaiian cooking. Where else? So it comes out in this one as well.
Yeah, taro root is it comes up in the Kanz book in Egypt, and it is also mentioned in Syria. So gourd or taro were the two vegetable recommendations for like vegetable combos recommended for this one. The Baghdad book, I think, also mentioned taro as an option. Nope, it was mainly eggplant. Eggplant and carrots were the two vegetables mentioned in, actually, I take that back. I think it was also mentioned in this one as well. Let me just exit out of the like slides for that one, because then I can see a little bit better in my notes. And because there was a second version of the dish that like mentioned other things. Oh, do I not have it in here? Yeah, because there's two versions that were mentioned in the Al-Waraq book. One that was like kind of went with the story of Bida, the slave girl, and her presentation to the Caliph, with all of these like multiple meats and all of this kind of stuff. And then the recipe that came right after the story matched but didn't quite match all of the items that were mentioned in the story and in like the poem that went with it. And I'm pretty sure that like in one of those versions, taro was also mentioned that you could do. And I've seen it showing up in the recipes for the Baghdadi book and the Syrian book and the Egyptian book several times also.
One other question. How did your group like it at the Great Western War?
At Great West, it went over very well. It was very popular. Everyone loved it. This one that was like primarily kind of a boiled meat and boiled vegetables in vinegar, not as popular. Also because it wasn't sweet at all. And this one, the Andalusian one, which like had a little bit of sweetness from the raisins, was a little bit more popular than the Baghdadi version without sugar, but not as popular as the one at Grey West, as the Egyptian one at Grey West, for sure.
I'm sitting here thinking, you made that for lunch?
Yeah. Because I wanted to do the redactions so that I could get the photos to like put in the slides, because I knew that I still needed to make this one so I could get the photos. Like I had done it before, but I hadn't taken photos. And so I was like, I need to get the photos so that I can share with people. So I put the stuff together to do yesterday for lunch.
I have a question. Some of the recipes mention ambergris, which of course is something you're not going to really get in the US.
Nope.
What would you recommend as a substitute?
That's a good question. I've been like avoiding doing the kind of super fancy version of the recipes that call for ambergris, in large part because of that. I know there is, so I need to look into how comestible these are, but I know there are like fake ambergris options these days for perfuming. So that would be like the first thing to check on, is if any of those are edible and could be included, because some things that we tend to think of are like, that I at least first, before I started getting into like doing this kind of cooking research, thought was like definitely not a food, and then found out later actually people do eat it all the time, like mastic. And you can get like mastic flavoring for candies and things like that. So there may, my first thought would be to look and see if there is a kind of edible musk flavoring that could be, you know, similar enough to the ambergris perfuming that it would have a similar like flavor profile to add in. But yeah,
Another question.
Would welcome suggestions.
What sent you down this rabbit hole?
Well, okay. It kind of started with the Andalusian book. And it started in a very weird way, because it started with me just misreading and misremembering stuff. So I had done a bunch of recipes out of the anonymous Andalusian, and I had found this recipe for this other vinegared stew, the mukallal stew that I was talking about, that like that it added eggs to it, but it wasn't pre-cooked eggs as like an egg crust. It was like scrambled eggs, and you added it to it and it turned into this like mustard sauce. And so it was this really sharp vinegared meat dish with a mustard like sauce. And I had served it at the time with like a very sweet carrot puree, so like a carrot electuary type of thing. And this was years ago, and it was delicious, like, because when you pair something really vinegar and sharp with something sweet, you get a really amazing flavor combination. And so I just had that kind of in my head as this really interesting dish, like this soured vinegar dish that was completely different from anything that I knew mundanely. And then as I started like collecting more of these cookbooks from this like time period and this region, kind of, you know, not just Al-Andalus, but like into the rest of the Arab speaking world here. So looking at these Baghdadi cookbooks and the Syrian cookbook and the Egyptian cookbook, I started collecting these and realized, hey, there's like all of these also have this dish that is made with vinegar and meat, but this one has sweetening agents in it. Like this one has some like sweet and sour stuff. And isn't that interesting? And this version, you know, has maybe a slightly different collection of spices and things. And isn't that really interesting? And so I just thought, you know, I really want to do a comparison. Like, how neat is it that there's this dish from Andalusia that has this like egg mustard sauce, and then there's these versions from like Syria and Baghdad that have like the sweet and sour and fruit stuff. And so I was like, so I was determined, okay, I'm going to do this comparison and contrast between these different recipes. And then when I went back and reread the Anonymous Andalusian, I was like, why can I not find this recipe that I remembered, this like weird egg sauce mustardy type of recipe? And then I realized when I was rereading it, because I found the Sikbaj recipe in the Andalusian, but it was different. It was different than I remembered, and it had egg in it, but it had egg as this egg crust as opposed to the mustard thing. And that's when I realized, oh, I had completely misremembered and thought that was Sikbaj, but in fact it was a different dish. So I'm lucky that like when I went back, I did find that there was a Sikbaj dish. It was just different than I had remembered. And it was still different enough from the others that it was, you know, interesting to do a redaction of and explore and see what that would be like. But yeah, it was, I misremembered a dish that I had done years ago and thought that it was the same one. But then it was so different. So like, that's really neat to do a comparison and contrast of the same thing across the centuries. And I'm like, oh, it wasn't actually what I remembered. And I end up having that problem a lot, where I start off doing a redaction based on my memory of stuff that I'm reading. And then it turns out that I read it wrong, or I misinterpreted it in some way. And then my redaction comes out kind of funky. And I go back and reread it like 2, 3, maybe even 4 times before I realize what my mistake was on misreading.
Do we know what kind of vinegars are used? They all mention vinegar, and I know you said you use red wine vinegar, but even if you go to the grocery store and you get one red wine vinegar from one place and a different red wine vinegar from a different place, there's some are not as sharp as others, and some have a more depth of flavor. So what have you tried different vinegars?
I have. So I've done this with apple cider vinegar, because apple cider is a lot less expensive than red wine vinegar. I haven't done it with like a balsamic vinegar. Mainly when I've done wine vinegar, I've done just like a regular red wine vinegar, like one of the cheaper options, because I need to get like a jug of it in order to do a large pot. One of the interesting things is in the Baghdad book, so the Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq book, there's a lot of discussion of vinegars. Like there's clearly a lot of different types of vinegar, including like date vinegar shows up in certain recipes, and it shows up as a vinegar that you can use. It also mentions distilled vinegars, which I didn't think was a thing. And initially when I was like doing the Andalusian redaction, I had assumed that the vinegar that they used was quite weak, because you are like covering the meat in it. And I kind of figured there's no way they could be doing this with like pure vinegar. It must be some kind of watered down vinegar. But then as I was reading more in this Baghdad book, they mentioned distilling vinegar, like specifically, and like the whole process. And I was like, yep, that's distilling right there. There's some interesting ones where you like distill vinegar with onions, like with onions kind of suspended over the mix, so that it like lends some of the flavor to the final distilling process and things. So I feel more confident now that like they really did use strong vinegar, you know, but it's still, you know, because the recipes for this particular dish are not super specific, you can do multiple, like you can try it with multiple different ones. And I, bet that would affect your final flavor as well. Like if you used some other flavored vinegar, like the onion one, for example, that this might come out very different. If you used a date vinegar, you might have more of a sweeter flavor profile at the end. So like maybe that was what you would use if you have a recipe like this Baghdadi one, where you're not adding explicit sugar to it or honey or other sweetening agent. Like maybe they just used a sweeter vinegar, and then that would change it also quite a bit. There's lots to explore, really.
Can you pull this one up a little further so I can see the whole verse?
Yeah, let me see. Oh, I don't know did that go properly, or is it not showing for everyone?
Oh, it's not showing at all.
Okay, then hold on just a sec. I'm gonna stop the share so that I can get it playing in the window, and then reshare.
That is beautiful.
Can you see it now?
No, not at all.
It's weird. It does show that it's sharing the screen.
I see the screens. Sarah, it might be, is your screen, depending on the view that you're using, you may not be seeing it, Sarah. So are you, is it the larger screen do you have up, or? Well, I guess either way, this is going to be recorded, so you can always take a look at it, when it's uploaded and so forth. So, because I've got it.
And I'm happy. So Mercy, let me know how you want me to send like the slides. I'm happy to send the keynote PDFs, like whatever would be helpful.
Yeah, PDF is probably good. You can email it. You've got my email, so yeah. That's probably the most safest for you, and it makes it smaller. So.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful picture of Baghdad.
Yeah, isn't it lovely?
I
didn't realize that it was circular, but
the city being done as a circle.
Yeah, it was. Baghdad was for many centuries the center of the Arab world, and I didn't realize until I've been listening to a podcast, the Ottoman History podcast, which I highly recommend. They don't just cover the Ottoman Empire, but actually like a lot of related time periods and regions throughout history. And one of the things that they talked about was completely off to having like tangential, but they talked about the Crusades from the Arab perspective, and like what were the contemporary Arabs at the time saying or thinking about the Crusaders and what was going on? And general consensus was like, the Crusades didn't ever get anywhere close to the true cities of importance, like Baghdad or even Damascus, where there was just little things happening in these kind of smaller regions that nobody really cared about all that much. And it was only when there was something that was threatening Baghdad that was like, okay, that is a really big deal. And so it's like, if Baghdad was sacked, then that was, okay, you have a complete change of rulership and, a brand new era of the region and of the world at that time. And part of it is because like, you look at this circular city, it's going to be real, and there's a moat, and it's going to be difficult to take this city because of how it's set up,
Did you put the name of that podcast in the chat?
Oh yeah, sure. Ottoman History Podcast. It's really good. So yeah, overall, I would say this dish is a really it's a really fun one. It's an interesting one to add to the repertoire because it is very different from anything that anybody else is, finding or cooking or serving. But it can be really delicious and really nice, like strong flavors. And on that note, I think so far from the ones that I have done the redaction for, I would highly recommend this, the like late century, the later period Egyptian one, this 14th century one, which again, whether that recipe is like actually all that late is super debatable, because what probably happened is you had collections of recipes that were copied and recopied and recopied. And so and this is one of the reasons why you have the same dish showing up in, the Iberian Peninsula and in Damascus and in Baghdad and in Cairo, across many different, like from the 10th century to the 14th centuries. Like it's not just that people are it's not just that people are recreating this dish for 300 years, but also that like the cookbooks that were written were not like wholly written by a single author. They were compilations. And so people were recopying from some other manual that had been used and saying, well, this is a classic dish, I'm going to recopy it. And like, maybe I'm going to add some details from some particular version that I heard about or that I really like. And so it gets copied in with, these different additions, like using the egg crust in the Iberian Peninsula, because eggs were so incredibly popular and like added as an additional garnish to pretty much everything. So it makes sense that like the version that you see made in that region is going to add the eggs like that. Whereas, something like this Egyptian one, we're like, well, pickled eggs, like do your pickle as an addition to this kind of sweet and sour dish. Pickles were incredibly popular, pickled vegetables as well as pickled eggs, like anything that you can pickle, you pickle. So it makes sense that you would have these kinds of additions, but the core recipe itself is probably older even than the 10th century, version that we've got written down. That was just how the recipes were like compiled and collected and passed down, is you have like everybody copying from similar sources that were also probably copied from similar sources that were copied from similar sources. So it's hard to tell like exactly how old this recipe is, but it's really neat to see so many kind of like different changes in versions and things through the ages.
What would be interesting to do? A tasting menu of several of the different ones.
It would be. It's because this is a pretty strong dish. Like the reason that I like this Egyptian one the best is because it's the most balanced. And if you're going to do a tasting menu of like all the different versions of Sikbaj specifically, you need to have like some water or some sweets or something in between to help you with the vinegar, because it can be quite strong. And I would really only want like a couple bites maybe per between like of each dish before I'd be like, okay, that is enough vinegar.
Thank you.
But yeah, be fun.
With the pickled eggs you made, what was your mixture of spices in with that?
That one, this is, I think I'm gonna again close out of the play on the keynote so that I can go back and look and see where my notes were. I didn't copy the precise recipe in here. So I thought for a lot of these, I copied the precise like text of the recipe, but I think for this one, because I wasn't focusing as much on the eggs, I didn't copy it over. This one has saffron, cloves, pepper, cinnamon, rose water, a mix of vinegar. And this one you could, so in the recipe, you can make it like a sweet and sour pickle again. So they say like optionally, you can add sugar to the pickling mixture. or not if you just want it like sour. And on this one, I did it just a pure sour because the stew that it was getting paired with did have a fair amount of sugar and sweetness. So we have like the sour pickle compared with the sweet and sour stew. This one also had some herbs. So it used rue and parsley, and I think basil as well. It was quite the combo. And you just kind of like mixed everything together in a, like heated the brine all up. And then you had the eggs were like, I did not a full hard boil because you put them into a warm brine and I didn't want them to get overcooked. So I did kind of a medium boiled egg, and you peel the egg, pierce them with a needle, and then soak them in salt water for a day. And that's how you get the salt into the egg. And you do that first before you prep the pickling brine. So then you have your like hot pickling brine with all of the spices, and then you put the eggs in there and stick it in a jar. And I think this was in the fridge like that for like 4 or 5 days before Great West, maybe like 4 days, maybe 4 days before service. And it was pretty perfect, but I think they would last longer also in the fridge as well. Yeah, it was kind of a neat procedure, like piercing the eggs with a needle and then soaking it in salt water before doing the brining.
Would you mind putting your email in the chat? So if we have any other questions or we come across any recipes that we want to share.
Yes, absolutely. So there's my like regular mundane email is ericaveris@gmail.com. I've also, so I haven't put the Sikbaj comparison like write up there yet, but I'm going to, like, since I put these slides together, there's no reason like not to do this now on the blog, but I do have a breast lamp blog, which is at WordPress. And that's where I often put a lot of my like redaction explorations and like experimenting with things. So it's a WordPress blog. And if I'm going to stop the share for a minute so that I can look up, because I think I have it in my other keynote, so that I can stick that in the chat as well. Here it is. So do a quick little copy paste. Oof, for crying out loud. All right, well, it's brasslampblog.wordpress.com. So that should work. Like that. So yeah, there's a good note to myself to like get the Sikbaj stuff up on the blog.
Okay, well, is there any other questions? Anybody? Any comments? Yep, I think you did a great job. Thank you so much for presenting. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Yeah, thanks everyone for